Picture this: Constantinople, April 1453. The greatest city in Christendom stands on the cusp of oblivion. For over 1,000 years, these walls have held back the tide of empires. Romans built them, Byzantines reinforced them, Crusaders violated them, and now an Ottoman army, numbering in the tens of thousands, surrounds them like a noose drawing tight around the neck of history itself. The air is thick with tension and the acrid smell of fear. Inside the triple walls, 7,000 defenders prepare to face what they know is coming. Outside, Sultan Mehmed II, barely 21 years old, stands before cannons so massive that their roar can be heard 10 miles away. This is not just the story of a siege. This is the story of how the ancient world finally, definitively, violently ended. This is the story of how a city that had survived everything from Persian invasions to Arab sieges to civil wars and plagues finally met its match. And this is the story of men who refused to surrender, who chose death over submission, who stood on walls they knew would fall and fought anyway, because some things are worth dying for. Before we dive into the blood and fire of 1453, we need to understand what Constantinople actually was. This was not just another medieval city. This was the living heir to Rome itself, the beating heart of an empire that traced its lineage back to Augustus Caesar. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476, Constantinople didn't just survive, it thrived. It became the richest, most sophisticated, most cultured city in the entire world. While Western Europe descended into chaos and darkness, Constantinople shone like a beacon of civilization. The Hagia Sophia rose above the city like a crown of stone and gold, its dome so massive that when Emperor Justinian first saw it completed in 537, he supposedly cried out that he had surpassed Solomon. The walls of Constantinople were legendary. 3 layers of fortifications stretching from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, studded with towers and protected by a moat. These were the Theodosian Walls, built in the 5th century, and for 1,000 years they had been considered virtually impregnable. The city itself sat at one of the most strategic locations on Earth, controlling the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Every trade route that mattered passed through Constantinople. Spices from India, silk from China, furs from Russia, gold from Africa. All of it flowed through this single city, making it obscenely wealthy. The emperors who ruled from the Great Palace commanded armies, controlled vast territories, and wielded influence that stretched from Italy to Persia. They called themselves Romans, and in every way that mattered they were. The language they spoke might have shifted from Latin to Greek, the religion from pagan to Christian, but the continuity was real. When you stood in Constantinople in the year 1000, you stood in a city that had been the capital of empire for 7 centuries, and you could reasonably expect it to stand for 7 centuries more. But empires don't last forever. They crack, they weaken, they bleed. And by 1453, the Byzantine Empire had been bleeding for a very long time. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 had been the first mortal wound. Western knights, supposedly marching to liberate Jerusalem, had instead been diverted by Venetian manipulation and greed to attack Constantinople itself. They sacked the city with a brutality that shocked even their own chroniclers. Churches were looted, libraries were burned, ancient statues were melted down for coin. The imperial treasury, accumulated over centuries, was emptied in a matter of days. And most damaging of all, the empire itself was shattered. The Crusaders carved up Byzantine territory like a Christmas goose, establishing their own Latin empire in Constantinople, while Byzantine nobles fled to set up rump states in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. The Byzantines eventually retook Constantinople in 1261, but they never truly recovered. The empire that emerged from this catastrophe was a pale shadow of its former glory. Territories were permanently lost. The economy never fully rebounded. Rival powers, particularly the Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa, had seized control of much of the trade that had once enriched Byzantine coffers. Then came the Black Death in the 14th century, killing nearly half of Constantinople's population. Civil wars erupted repeatedly as rival claimants to the throne tore the empire apart from within. And through it all, a new threat was rising in the east: the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans had begun as a small Anatolian principality, one of many Turkish states that emerged after the collapse of the Seljuk Empire. But under a succession of brilliant and ruthless leaders, they expanded rapidly, conquering territory after territory, absorbing rival states, building an army that combined traditional cavalry with innovative infantry tactics, and crucially, embracing the new technology of gunpowder artillery. By 1400, the Ottoman Empire had swallowed almost all of Byzantine Anatolia and most of the Balkans. Constantinople itself was completely surrounded by Ottoman territory, an isolated Christian island in an Ottoman sea. The empire that had once stretched from Spain to Syria was reduced to the city itself, a few scattered islands, and a portion of the Peloponnese. It was not an empire anymore. It was a city-state living on borrowed time. The Byzantines knew it. They sent desperate embassies to Western Europe, begging for help, offering to reunify the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches if only the West would send armies to save them. But the West was divided, distracted, and frankly didn't much care. The papacy wanted religious submission first. France was exhausted from the 100 Years' War. England was descending into the Wars of the Roses. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of squabbling German princes. Venice and Genoa sent token support, but were more interested in preserving their trading privileges than in mounting a serious military expedition. Constantinople stood alone, and everyone knew what was coming. When Mehmed II became Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in 1451, he was 19 years old, and he had a dream that consumed him. He would do what no Ottoman ruler before him had managed. He would conquer Constantinople. He would add the Queen of Cities to his domain. He would make himself the heir to Rome. This was not just military ambition. This was historical destiny, as Mehmed saw it. Constantinople had been besieged by Muslim forces multiple times over the centuries, by Arabs in the 7th and 8th centuries, by various Turkish forces in the centuries since, but it had never fallen to them. The walls had always held. The defenders had always endured. Constantinople had become a symbol of Christian resistance to Islam, and its continued existence was a thorn in the side of every Muslim ruler who looked at a map and saw this Christian city squatting in the middle of what should have been Muslim territory. Mehmed was a complex figure. Educated, speaking multiple languages, interested in philosophy and art, he was also capable of extreme cruelty and possessed of a will that bent toward his goals with frightening intensity. He was moody, unpredictable, ruthless when he needed to be, and capable of sudden acts of mercy when it suited him. But more than anything, he was ambitious. And he understood something that previous Ottoman rulers had not fully grasped. The key to taking Constantinople was not courage, or numbers, or even faith. It was technology. Specifically, it was cannons. Big ones. In 1452, Mehmed began his preparations in earnest. First, he ordered the construction of a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from an existing fortress on the Asian side. This new fortress, called Rumeli Hisari, was positioned at the narrowest point of the strait and was completed in a staggering 4 months. Its purpose was simple and brutal: to cut off Constantinople from the Black Sea, to prevent any supplies or reinforcements from reaching the city from that direction, to strangle the Byzantines economically and militarily. When Byzantine ambassadors protested this construction as a violation of treaties, Mehmed essentially told them to go to hell. He was done with diplomacy. This was war, whether the Byzantines admitted it yet or not. Then came the cannons. Mehmed summoned to his court a Hungarian engineer named Urban, sometimes called Orban in the sources. Urban was a genius, one of the greatest artillery designers of his age, and he had originally offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine. But Constantine, ruling over a treasury that was perpetually empty, could not afford Urban's price. So Urban did what skilled mercenaries have always done. He went to the man who could pay him. Mehmed asked Urban if he could build a cannon powerful enough to destroy the walls of Constantinople. Urban's reply has echoed through history. He said he could build a cannon that would destroy not only the walls of Constantinople, but the walls of Babylon itself. Urban set to work. What he created was a monster. The largest cannon ever built up to that point in history, a bronze behemoth 27 feet long, with a barrel diameter of 30 inches and walls 8 inches thick. It could fire a stone ball weighing half a ton over a distance of more than a mile. Just imagine that for a moment. A 1,200-pound projectile of solid granite, hurtling through the air at a velocity high enough to smash through stone fortifications that had stood for 1,000 years. When the cannon was tested, witnesses reported that the sound could be heard 10 miles away and that the ground shook like an earthquake. Women in labor miscarried from the shock. This was not just a weapon, it was a message. The age of impregnable walls was over. But there was a catch. The monster cannon, which came to be called the basilic, was almost as dangerous to its operators as it was to its targets. It had to be taken apart to be loaded, with the stone ball inserted into the front section and massive amounts of gunpowder packed into the rear before the two halves were screwed back together. It sat on a platform made mostly of packed earth and logs, designed to absorb the tremendous recoil that could literally crush men who stood too close. It took hours to load and could only be fired 7 times a day because the barrel had to cool between shots or risk exploding. And despite all precautions, it did develop cracks almost immediately. But it didn't need to fire often. Every time it did, it tore chunks out of walls that had weathered 10 centuries of warfare. The basilic was just the largest of 70 cannons that Urban and other Ottoman engineers produced for Mehmed's siege. The Ottomans understood that this was a new kind of warfare, and they embraced it completely. By March 1453, these massive guns were being transported from the Ottoman capital of Edirne to Constantinople, a journey that required hundreds of men and dozens of oxen just to haul the basilic alone. Roads had to be reinforced, bridges had to be rebuilt. This was a logistical nightmare, but Mehmed pushed through it because he knew that these guns were his key to victory. By early April, everything was in place. Mehmed had assembled an army estimated at between 60,000 and 80,000 men. Seasoned janissaries, the elite infantry corps that formed the core of Ottoman military power. Regular infantry and cavalry units from Anatolia and the Balkans. Engineers and miners. Thousands of irregular troops called Bashi Bazouks, who were motivated more by the promise of plunder than by discipline. And supporting this land force was a fleet of over 300 vessels, ranging from large warships to transport galleys to smaller craft, all designed to blockade the city from the sea and prevent any relief force from arriving by water. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI faced this approaching storm with a courage that history would remember even as it mourned what came next. Constantine was 48 years old in 1453, a career soldier and administrator who had spent much of his adult life governing the Byzantine territories in the Peloponnese. He had become emperor in 1449 after the death of his brother John VIII, and he inherited an impossible situation. The empire was bankrupt. The population of Constantinople itself had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 people, down from hundreds of thousands in the city's glory days. Vast areas within the walls were now empty fields and abandoned neighborhoods. The once mighty Byzantine army was a memory. Constantine could muster perhaps 7,000 men to defend 14 miles of walls, 7,000 against 80,000. The math was brutal. Constantine knew he needed help. He sent embassies to every Christian power he could reach, begging for assistance. He agreed to the union of the Catholic and Orthodox churches, a deeply unpopular move among his own people, who remembered all too well how the Catholic Crusaders had sacked their city 2.5 centuries earlier. Many Byzantines would rather face the Turks than submit to Rome. There was a famous saying attributed to the Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, who supposedly said it would be better to see the Turkish turban in the center of the city than the Latin mitre. Whether he actually said this is debatable, but it captured the sentiment of many. The religious divide between East and West had become so poisoned by centuries of mutual suspicion and outright hostility that even in the face of extinction, many Orthodox Christians could not bring themselves to accept Catholic authority. The help that did arrive was inadequate, but not insignificant. Venice sent 2 ships and 800 men, with promises of more to follow that never materialized. The Pope pledged 5 armed ships that were still preparing to sail when Constantinople fell. And crucially, in January 1453, a Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani arrived with 700 men. Giustiniani was an expert in defensive warfare, particularly in defending walled cities, and Constantine immediately recognized his value. He gave Giustiniani overall command of the land wall defenses, and for the next few months, Giustiniani worked tirelessly to repair the walls, position defenders, stockpile weapons and ammunition, and prepare for the siege he knew was coming. The Byzantines also had a secret weapon of sorts, a massive chain made of links as thick as a man's arm, stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn. This harbour was Constantinople's primary port, and it was protected by this chain which prevented enemy ships from entering. As long as that chain held, the Byzantines only had to defend the land walls on 3 sides. The sea walls along the Golden Horn could be lightly defended, allowing Constantine to concentrate his meagre forces where they were most needed. On April 5, 1453, Mehmed sent one final offer to Constantine: surrender the city peacefully, and you and your people can leave unharmed. Constantine's reply has been preserved in several sources. He said that surrendering the city was beyond his authority or anyone else's, that all of them had decided to die of their own free will rather than give up Constantinople. On April 6th, the bombardment began. The Ottoman cannons opened fire with a roar that must have sounded like the end of the world. The basilic and its smaller cousins began systematically pounding the walls, targeting specific sections with a persistence that slowly, inexorably, began to tell. Stone that had stood for 1,000 years cracked. Towers that had weathered countless sieges started to crumble, and every day, the defenders worked frantically through the night to repair the damage, filling breaches with timber and rubble, shoring up weakened sections, knowing that tomorrow the cannons would roar again and undo their work. It was Sisyphean labour. They could never fully repair the damage before new damage was inflicted. All they could do was slow the inevitable. The Byzantines had cannons of their own, about 15 in total, but they were smaller and less numerous. They fired back when they could, trying to suppress the Ottoman batteries, but it was hopelessly unequal. One of the larger Byzantine cannons did manage to damage an Ottoman gun position, but then it burst from the strain of repeated firing. After that, the Byzantines were even more cautious about using their artillery, knowing they couldn't afford to lose what few guns they had. The siege settled into a brutal rhythm. The Ottomans would bombard the walls by day, and when sections collapsed, they would launch assaults with infantry trying to overwhelm the defenders before the breach could be repaired. The Byzantines would fight desperately to hold every foot of wall, throwing back wave after wave of attackers, then work through the night to rebuild. Constantine was everywhere, moving along the walls, encouraging his men, fighting alongside them when assaults came, making himself visible as a symbol that the city had not given up. Giustiniani commanded the most vulnerable sections, and his presence and tactical skill were crucial in holding back the Ottoman tide. But everyone could see that it was only a matter of time. The defenders were exhausted, supplies were running low, the walls were being chewed apart bit by bit, and there was no relief force coming. Then, Mehmed executed one of the most audacious tactical moves of the entire siege. Remember that chain across the Golden Horn? It had prevented the Ottoman fleet from attacking the sea walls there, forcing the Ottomans to concentrate on the land walls. But Mehmed found a way around it. He ordered his engineers to construct a road of greased logs over the hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata, from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn. Then, incredibly, he had 70 of his ships dragged overland on this road, hauled by teams of oxen and hundreds of men, and launched into the Golden Horn behind the chain. It was a feat of engineering and determination that stunned everyone, Byzantine and Ottoman alike. Suddenly, the Byzantines had to defend another section of wall that they had thought was secure. Constantine had to pull men from the already undermanned land walls to guard against this new threat, spreading his forces even thinner. It was a masterstroke by Mehmed, and it significantly worsened the Byzantine position. There was one moment of hope. On April 20th, 4 ships, 3 Genoese and 1 Byzantine, managed to fight their way through the Ottoman blockade and reach Constantinople. They had been sent weeks earlier and had battled against Ottoman galleys in full view of both armies. The Byzantines on the walls cheered as they watched their ships, with favourable winds filling their sails, smash through lighter Ottoman vessels and reach the safety of the Golden Horn. Mehmed was reportedly furious at his admiral's failure to stop them, and some sources say he actually waded into the sea in his rage, striking at the water with his sword. The supplies and reinforcements on those 4 ships were desperately needed, but they were also woefully insufficient. 4 ships could not save a city that needed a fleet. As April turned to May, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The defenders were so exhausted that they could barely stand. Men were sleeping at their posts. Food was being rationed. The walls were in worse shape every day despite constant repairs. Mehmed sent another offer. Surrender now, and I will allow Constantine to rule as governor of the Peloponnese, and the people can leave with their possessions. Constantine refused again. There would be no surrender. Then strange omens began to appear, or at least that's how the terrified populace interpreted them. On May 22nd, there was a partial lunar eclipse, and people remembered an old prophecy that Constantinople would fall when the moon showed a sign in the heavens. 4 days later, a dense fog rolled over the city, something virtually unheard of in May. When the fog lifted that evening, witnesses reported seeing a strange light playing around the dome of the Hagia Sophia. Some said it was the Holy Spirit abandoning the city. Others tried to dismiss it as natural phenomena. But the psychological impact was devastating. People felt that even God had given up on Constantinople. On May 27th, Constantine knew the end was near. Mehmed had ordered a day of rest for his troops before launching what everyone understood would be the final assault. Constantine spent that day making his rounds of the city. He visited the Hagia Sophia and took communion, knowing it might be the last time. He addressed his commanders and soldiers one final time, thanking them for their service, urging them to hold fast one more time, reminding them that they were defending not just a city, but a civilization, a faith, an idea that had endured for over 1,000 years. Sources say that grown men wept as Constantine spoke, knowing that these were likely his final words to them. That evening, both sides prepared for the battle that would decide everything. The Ottomans moved into position under cover of darkness, massing at the weakest points in the walls. The Byzantines manned the ramparts, knowing that this night would determine whether they lived or died, whether their city survived or fell. Constantine took his place at the most vulnerable section of wall, near the gate of St. Romanus, where Giustiniani was commanding. He would not direct the battle from safety. He would fight and die with his men. At 1:30 in the morning on May 29th, the Ottoman assault began. Mehmed had planned it in waves, each designed to wear down the defenders before the final push. The first wave was composed of Bashi bazooks, irregular troops who were considered expendable. They were sent forward in a mass assault against the land walls, and they came on like a human tide, screaming war cries, clambering over rubble, throwing themselves at the walls with ladders and grappling hooks. The defenders met them with arrows, crossbow bolts, stones, Greek fire, everything they had. The fighting was savage and chaotic. Men died by the hundreds in close quarters combat on the ramparts, but the defenders held. After 2 hours, the Bashi bazooks fell back, battered and broken. They had failed to breach the walls, but they had accomplished their purpose. The Byzantine defenders were now exhausted from 2 hours of brutal fighting, and the night was far from over. The second wave came at dawn. This time, Mehmed sent his regular Anatolian troops, better trained and better equipped than the Bashi bazooks. The cannons had torn open multiple breaches in the outer wall, and the Anatolians surged through these gaps, trying to overwhelm the defenders by sheer weight of numbers. The fighting intensified. Constantine and Giustiniani were everywhere, directing the defense, leading counterattacks, holding the line by force of will as much as by steel. For 2 more hours, the battle raged. Bodies piled up in the breaches. Blood made the stones slick. The defenders were fighting on their last reserves of strength, but they held. The Anatolians were thrown back, but everyone knew what was coming next. The third wave would be the Janissaries, the elite of the Ottoman army, fresh and ready to exploit the exhaustion of the defenders. These were the best soldiers in the Ottoman Empire, fanatically loyal to the Sultan, superbly trained and motivated by a combination of religious zeal and the promise of being the first to loot a city that had been rich for 1,000 years. As the Janissaries prepared to attack, disaster struck the defense. Giustiniani was hit, probably by a crossbow bolt or a bullet from a small firearm. Nobody is quite sure. The wound was serious, penetrating his armor and leaving him bleeding heavily. His men carried him from the walls to seek medical treatment. And here, in one of the most controversial moments of the siege, Giustiniani made a decision that may have doomed the city. Instead of having his wound dressed quickly so he could return to the walls, he insisted on being evacuated from the city entirely, taken to a ship that could get him to safety. Constantine reportedly pleaded with him to stay, but Giustiniani was too badly hurt, too afraid, or both. He left. And when the defenders saw that their commander was abandoning the walls, morale shattered. Rumors spread that the wall had been breached, that the battle was lost, that it was every man for himself. In the confusion and panic, a small postern gate near where Giustiniani had been commanding was left unbarred, or perhaps opened by someone fleeing. The sources are unclear. The Janissaries found it. A group of Ottoman soldiers, maybe 30 or 40, pushed through this small gate and found themselves inside the walls. They climbed to the top of a tower and planted the Ottoman flag. When the defenders saw that flag flying inside the walls, they panicked. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Men who had fought for hours abandoned their positions. Some tried to flee. Some kept fighting but knew it was hopeless. The Janissaries poured through the breach, widening it, letting more and more of their comrades through. The walls were falling. The city was being overrun. Constantine saw what was happening. He reportedly stripped off his imperial regalia so he could not be identified, so his body would not be dishonored if captured. Then he drew his sword and rode into the thickest fighting near the St. Romanus Gate. What happened next is unclear. Some sources say he died fighting on the walls. Others say he fell in the streets below. Some claim his body was later found and identified by his purple boots embroidered with eagles. Others say his body was never found at all, that he disappeared into the chaos of that terrible morning. Mehmed supposedly ordered a search for Constantine's body, and when it was allegedly found, he had the head cut off and sent as a trophy to various courts, or so some sources claim. But the truth is, nobody really knows exactly how or where Constantine died. What we know is that he refused to flee, refused to surrender, and died fighting for his city. He became the last Roman emperor, and his death on that wall was the final punctuation mark on an empire that had lasted for over 1,400 years. Once the Janissaries were inside the walls, the battle became a massacre. The Ottomans had been promised 3 days of looting, as was customary after a city was taken by storm. They spread through Constantinople like a flood, killing any man who offered resistance, taking women and children as slaves, looting churches and palaces and homes. The scenes were horrific. People who had fled to the Hagia Sophia for sanctuary found none. The great church was desecrated. Icons were smashed. Precious metals were torn from the walls. Women were raped on the altar. Priests were killed where they stood. The streets ran with blood. Bodies piled up faster than they could be counted. Witnesses described having to wade through corpses to move through certain parts of the city. The historian George Francis, who was there, wrote that the Turks became masters of Constantinople and seized anyone in front of them, slaughtering those who resisted, and in some places you could not distinguish the ground from the corpses. It was beyond horror. It was the end of the world for the Byzantines who lived through it. Mehmed entered the city in triumph on the afternoon of May 29th. He rode to the Hagia Sophia and dismounted. He picked up a handful of dirt and poured it over his head, a gesture of humility before God. Then he ordered that the church be converted into a mosque, a transformation that was completed almost immediately. The great cathedral that had stood for 900 years as the heart of Orthodox Christianity was now a Muslim house of worship. The symbolism was devastating. Mehmed also began immediate work to restore the city. He understood that Constantinople was too valuable to simply let it remain a ruined, depopulated husk. He ordered that Greeks who had fled be encouraged to return with guarantees of safety. He brought in Muslim and Christian populations from other parts of his empire and forced them to settle in Constantinople. He restored the Orthodox Patriarchate, recognizing that he needed the cooperation of the Christian population. He appointed a Greek scholar named Gennadios as Patriarch, essentially making him the leader of Orthodox Christians throughout the Ottoman Empire. It was a shrewd political move, giving Christians a stake in the new order and preventing unified resistance. Within a few years, Constantinople, now increasingly called Istanbul, though the official name change wouldn't come until 1930, had been transformed into the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Mosques rose alongside churches. The palace complex on the Seraglio Point became the center of Ottoman government. The city that had been the last remnant of Rome became the heart of a new Islamic empire that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the Christian world. When news reached Rome, the Pope called for a new crusade, but there was no real enthusiasm for it. Western Europe mourned and moved on. The Italian city-states adjusted to the new reality and continued trading with the Ottomans. The refugees who fled Constantinople, particularly Greek scholars carrying ancient manuscripts, scattered across Europe, particularly to Italy, where they would contribute to the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance. They brought with them classical texts that had been preserved in Constantinople's libraries, works of Greek philosophy and literature and science that would profoundly influence European thought. In that sense, the fall of Constantinople helped to spark the rebirth of classical learning in the West, though it was cold comfort to those who had lost everything. For the Byzantines themselves, the fall was the end of everything. For over 1,000 years, they had seen themselves as Romans, the true heirs of Augustus and Constantine and Justinian. They had preserved Roman law, Roman administration, Roman military tradition, even as they spoke Greek and practiced Orthodox Christianity. They had survived the fall of the West. They had survived Arab invasions and Turkish incursions and Latin crusaders. But they could not survive Mehmed's cannons. The empire that Constantine the Great had founded in 330 died when Constantine XI fell on those walls in 1453. It's impossible to overstate how significant this was. The Roman Empire, in one form or another, had existed for over 1,500 years. It had been the dominant power of the ancient world. Even in its medieval Byzantine form, it had been a beacon of culture and learning and Christian faith. Its fall was not just a military defeat. It was the end of an era. Medieval chroniclers recognized this immediately. They called it the fall of the city, and they knew that the world would never be the same. For the Ottomans, the conquest of Constantinople was the validation of centuries of effort. They had besieged the city before and failed. Now they had succeeded, and the victory announced to the world that the Ottoman Empire was the new dominant power in the region. Mehmed took the title Caesar of Rome, claiming to be the successor to the Byzantine emperors, and in a sense, he was right. The Ottomans would rule the territories that had once been Byzantine for the next 4.5 centuries until the empire finally collapsed after World War I. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, would remain one of the great cities of the world, though it would never again be quite what it had been. The walls that had protected it for 1,000 years were repaired, but no longer needed. The age of medieval fortifications was ending. The age of gunpowder had arrived. The tactical lessons of the siege were clear to military observers across Europe. Walls, no matter how strong, could no longer protect cities from artillery. Fortification design would have to change dramatically to account for this new reality. Star forts with angled bastions designed to deflect cannon fire would become the new standard. The era of siege warfare had fundamentally changed, and Constantinople had been the proof. But beyond the military and political consequences, there was a psychological impact that cannot be quantified. Constantinople had been a symbol. For Christians, it was the greatest city of the Orthodox world, the New Rome, the fortress that had held back the Islamic tide for centuries. Its fall shattered that sense of security. For Muslims, particularly the Ottomans, its conquest was proof of divine favor, validation of their expansion, encouragement to push even further into Europe. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. There are legends that emerged from the fall, legends that persist to this day in Greek culture. The most famous is the legend of the Marble King. According to this story, when Constantine saw that the city was lost, an angel appeared and turned him into marble, preserving him in a cave beneath the city. One day, the legend says, he will awaken and lead an army to reconquer Constantinople and restore the Byzantine Empire. It's a myth, of course, a way of coping with catastrophic loss, a refusal to accept finality. But it speaks to how deeply the fall affected the Greek consciousness. To this day, May 29th is remembered in Greece as a day of mourning for the fall of the city. And to this day, some Greeks still refer to Istanbul as Constantinople, still dream of the day when Hagia Sophia will be a church again, still carry the weight of that defeat over 5.5 centuries ago. History doesn't often give us clear breaking points, clear moments, when we can say this is when the old world ended and the new world began. But the fall of Constantinople is one of them. It ended the Middle Ages. It began the early modern period. It announced that gunpowder had changed warfare forever. It shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean. It contributed to the Renaissance by scattering scholars and texts across Italy. It redrew the map of Europe and Asia, and it ended the longest continuous political entity in European history, the Roman Empire that had begun with Augustus and ended with Constantine. When we look back at the siege itself, what stands out is the courage on both sides. The Ottoman soldiers who threw themselves against those walls day after day, wave after wave, dying in heaps for the glory of conquest and faith, and the Byzantine defenders who stood on those walls, knowing they were doomed, knowing that no relief was coming, knowing that every day might be their last, and standing there anyway because Constantinople was worth dying for. There's something profoundly tragic about the last days of the city. Constantine and his men were fighting not just for territory or political power, but for the survival of a civilization. They knew what they were defending. They knew what would be lost if they failed, and they fought to the last. Imagine being a soldier on those walls in the final days. You haven't slept properly in weeks. You're half starved because supplies are running out. Every day the cannons tear apart the walls you spent all night repairing. You've lost friends, brothers, comrades in the fighting. You know there are 80,000 enemy soldiers surrounding you and only 7,000 defenders. You know no help is coming. The West has abandoned you. You're alone. And yet, when the drums beat and the janissaries come screaming up the walls, you pick up your sword or your spear or your bow and you fight. Why? Because some things are bigger than self-preservation. Because loyalty and honor and faith matter. Because Constantinople is not just a city but an idea. And ideas are worth dying for. That's what makes the fall of Constantinople so compelling even now. It's not just a military history story about tactics and cannons. It's a human story about people facing impossible odds and choosing to fight anyway. And on the Ottoman side, you have to recognize the determination and skill. Mehmed was 21 years old when he conquered Constantinople. 21. He planned that siege with meticulous care. He understood the importance of artillery when most medieval commanders were still focused on traditional siege tactics. He solved the problem of the golden horn chain with ingenuity. He kept his army together and motivated through weeks of bloody fighting. He was brutal when he needed to be and generous when it served his purposes. He built an empire that would last for centuries, and it all began with those 53 days outside Constantinople. The siege was a masterclass in how to conduct a military campaign, and Mehmed deserves recognition as one of the great commanders of his age. But that doesn't make the fall any less tragic for those who lost. History isn't about good guys and bad guys. It's about power and ambition and ideas clashing, about cultures in conflict, about the rise of some at the expense of others. The Ottomans won, the Byzantines lost, and the world changed. Let's talk more about the weapons that made this siege so revolutionary. Urban's cannons were not the first artillery pieces used in warfare, but they represented a quantum leap in destructive capability. Earlier cannons had been relatively small, useful for battering down wooden gates or terrorizing defenders with noise, but not particularly effective against serious stone fortifications. What Urban created was something entirely different. The basilic, that monster gun we discussed earlier, was a feat of engineering that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with bronze casting technology. The barrel alone required over 20 tons of bronze. The casting process was extraordinarily difficult. Any air bubbles or impurities in the metal could create weak points that would cause the barrel to explode when fired. Urban had to construct a massive clay mold, pour molten bronze at precisely the right temperature, and pray that it cooled evenly. The fact that the gun worked at all was remarkable. The fact that it could be fired repeatedly, albeit slowly and with constant risk of catastrophic failure, was extraordinary. But the basilica wasn't just big. It was part of a coordinated artillery strategy that Mehmed employed with sophistication that was ahead of its time. The 70 cannons in the Ottoman battery were organized by size and purpose. The monster guns, like the basilica, were used for breaching, aimed at specific sections of wall to pound them into rubble. Medium-sized cannons provided sustained bombardment to keep defenders' heads down and prevent effective repairs. Smaller pieces could be moved quickly to support assaults or target specific defensive positions, like towers where archers were concentrated. The Ottomans had essentially created the first modern artillery park, and they used it with a level of coordination that would have been impressive in the Napoleonic Wars 3.5 centuries later. The psychological impact of these weapons cannot be overstated. Imagine you're a Byzantine soldier who has been told all your life that the Theodosian Walls are impregnable. Your grandfather defended these walls. Your father defended these walls. These walls have stood for over 1,000 years. They are a fact of nature, as permanent as the hills. And then you watch a single shot from a cannon tear a hole through 3 layers of stone. You watch towers that have stood since before your ancestors were born crumble into dust. You hear that roar, that godlike thunder, and you feel the ground shake beneath your feet. How do you process that? How do you maintain faith in your defenses when you can literally watch them being destroyed before your eyes? The Byzantines tried everything they could think of to counter the Ottoman artillery. They hung bales of wool and leather hides on the walls to absorb the impact of the cannonballs. They built wooden palisades behind breaches to create secondary defensive lines. They worked frantically every night to repair the damage, filling gaps with rubble and timber and anything else they could find. And credit to them, these measures did slow the Ottoman advance. The siege lasted 7 weeks when it might have ended much sooner. But ultimately, you cannot repair stone walls faster than cannons can destroy them. The mathematics were against the Byzantines from the start, and here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The basilica was not a secret weapon. The Byzantines knew it existed. They had seen it tested. They had heard the reports from spies and informants about this monster gun that could destroy Babylon itself. They had months to prepare for it. But what could they do? They couldn't match Ottoman artillery production because they didn't have the money or the resources. They couldn't strengthen the walls beyond what had already been done over centuries of reinforcement. They couldn't evacuate the city because where would they go? They were trapped between the walls they had always trusted and the guns that could destroy those walls. It was a perfect storm of technological change and geopolitical isolation. Now let's talk about the human side of the siege in more detail, because the tactical and technological aspects are only part of the story. Inside Constantinople during those 7 weeks, you had a population that was slowly starving, slowly being ground down by terror and exhaustion. The constant bombardment meant that nobody slept properly. The roar of cannons, the crash of stone, the screams of the wounded. It was relentless. Food was rationed early on because Constantine knew this siege could last months. People were eating whatever they could find. Gardens within the city walls were stripped bare. Animals that would normally be kept for breeding were slaughtered and eaten. Rats became a viable food source. Disease began to spread as sanitation deteriorated. Bodies from the nightly fighting had to be buried quickly in mass graves, and sometimes there wasn't time for proper burial at all. The smell alone must have been horrific. And through all of this, religious fervour intensified. Icons that had been stored in churches for centuries were brought out and paraded around the walls, with priests chanting prayers and citizens following behind, begging God and the Virgin Mary and every saint they could name to save the city. There were reports of miracles and signs that people interpreted as either hope or doom depending on their mindset. That light around the Hagia Sophia dome that we mentioned earlier, some saw it as the Holy Spirit's presence, others as the Spirit departing. When a statue of the Virgin Mary being carried in procession supposedly fell from its platform, people interpreted it as Mary abandoning the city. The psychological warfare was as intense as the physical warfare. Mehmed understood this. He made sure his troops were visible from the walls, made sure the Byzantines could see the sheer size of the Ottoman camp, could count the tents that seemed to stretch to the horizon. He had his men sing and chant and beat drums at night to prevent the defenders from resting. He stage-managed the siege to maximize the psychological pressure on the defenders. The defenders themselves were a mixed group, and the dynamics between them were complicated. You had the native Byzantine Greeks who were fighting for their homes, their families, their faith, their empire. Then you had the Genoese and Venetian contingents who were there partly out of religious solidarity, but also because they had commercial interests in Constantinople and knew that if it fell, their trading networks would be disrupted. There was constant tension between the Latins and the Greeks. Centuries of religious schism and the memory of the Fourth Crusade meant that Greeks distrusted Westerners even when they were fighting side by side. There were arguments about strategy, about where to allocate the limited defenders, about whether to make sorties against the Ottoman camp or stay behind the walls. Constantine had to mediate these disputes constantly, had to keep his coalition together when distrust and exhaustion threatened to tear it apart. Giustiniani's presence was crucial in this regard. He was respected by both Greeks and Latins, recognized as a professional soldier who knew his craft. His command of the most vulnerable section of wall, near the St. Romanus Gate, was critical to holding back multiple Ottoman assaults, which makes his departure from the walls during the final battle all the more controversial and historically significant. Some historians have defended him, arguing that his wound was genuinely severe and that he had no choice but to seek treatment. Others have accused him of cowardice, suggesting that he panicked when he saw how close the Ottomans were to breaking through and decided to save his own skin. The truth is probably somewhere in between. He was badly wounded, that much seems clear. But the decision to leave the city entirely, rather than having his wound dressed quickly so he could return to the walls, that decision may have been the turning point that doomed Constantinople. When the defenders saw their commander leaving, morale collapsed. The coordination of the defense fell apart, and in the confusion, that postern gate was left open, or was opened, and the Janissaries got through. Giustiniani survived the siege, by the way. He made it to a Genoese ship and sailed to Chios, where he died of his wounds a few days later. History has not been kind to his memory in the Greek world. He is remembered as the man who abandoned Constantinople in its darkest hour, fairly or not. Constantine, by contrast, is remembered as a hero, a martyr, a king who chose death over dishonor. The contrast between the two men at that crucial moment, Giustiniani leaving and Constantine staying, has become a defining narrative of the siege. It's the story of the foreigner who fled and the native who stood firm. It may not be entirely fair to Giustiniani, but it's how history has judged him. Let's also talk about what happened to the survivors, because the fall of Constantinople didn't end with Mehmed's entry into the city. Thousands of Byzantines were killed in the initial sack. Thousands more were enslaved. The Ottoman soldiers who stormed the city had been promised 3 days of looting, and they took full advantage. Anyone who had value as a slave, particularly women and children, was taken. Families were separated. People who had been wealthy aristocrats one day were slaves the next. The fortunate ones were those who had the means to ransom themselves or who were bought by masters who treated them relatively well. The unfortunate ones disappeared into the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire and were never heard from again. Some prominent Byzantines managed to escape. The historian George Francis, who I mentioned earlier, survived and eventually wrote a chronicle of the fall. the scholar George of Trebizond fled to Italy. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, who had been in Constantinople to promote church union, escaped dressed as a beggar, but many of the Byzantine nobility died in the fighting or were executed afterward. Mehmed was looking for specific individuals, particularly members of the imperial family and high-ranking officials who might become figureheads for resistance. Most of them were found and killed. The population of Constantinople before the siege has been estimated at around 50,000. After the siege, it may have been as low as 10,000. The majority were either dead, enslaved, or had fled. Mehmed's efforts to repopulate the city were necessary because Constantinople was too important to leave as a ghost town. He forced Ottoman subjects, both Muslim and Christian, to relocate there. He invited Jews who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal to settle in the city. Within a generation, Constantinople had a population of several 100,000 again, but it was a completely different city, demographically and culturally. The Byzantine Greeks who remained became a minority in what had been their capital for over 1,000 years. The transformation was total. One of the most poignant aspects of the fall was what happened to the city's cultural treasures. Constantinople had been accumulating art, manuscripts, and relics for over a millennium. The libraries contained classical texts that existed nowhere else in the world. The churches were filled with icons and religious art of incalculable value. The palaces held treasures that represented the wealth of centuries. Much of this was destroyed or stolen during the sack. Manuscripts were torn apart for their valuable bindings, with the parchment pages scattered in the streets. Bronze statues were melted down for their metal. Gold and silver were looted from churches. Some treasures survived. Some were hidden by their owners and later recovered. Some were taken by the Ottomans and preserved in their own collections. But much was simply lost forever. The intellectual heritage of Byzantium was scattered to the winds. The Greek scholars who fled to the west brought what they could carry. Manuscripts, their own knowledge of classical Greek language and literature, their expertise in fields ranging from theology to astronomy to medicine. These refugees found welcome in Italy particularly, where the Renaissance was already beginning to flower. Wealthy Italian patrons like the Medici family in Florence employed Byzantine scholars as tutors and translators. These scholars taught Greek to a new generation of Western humanists, translated classical texts that had been unknown in the West, and contributed to the revival of classical learning that defined the Renaissance. In a very real sense, the fall of Constantinople helped to spark the intellectual rebirth of Europe. It's a historical irony that the death of Byzantium contributed to the flowering of Western culture. But the irony would have been cold comfort to the scholars who had lost everything, who spent the rest of their lives in exile, teaching Latin speakers about Homer and Plato while mourning the city they would never see again. There's another consequence of the fall that we need to discuss, and that's the impact on exploration and the age of discovery. Before 1453, European trade with Asia had gone through Constantinople. Spices, silk, and other luxury goods from India and China travelled overland through Central Asia or by ship through the Indian Ocean and Red Sea, then through Ottoman territory to Constantinople, where Venetian and Genoese merchants bought them and distributed them throughout Europe. With Constantinople under Ottoman control, this trade route became more expensive and less reliable. The Ottomans controlled the flow of goods and could charge whatever they wanted. European merchants and monarchs began looking for alternative routes to Asia, routes that bypassed Ottoman territory entirely. This desire to find a sea route to India was one of the driving forces behind the age of exploration. Portuguese explorers worked their way down the coast of Africa throughout the 15th century, eventually rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and reaching India in 1498. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 was an attempt to reach Asia by sailing west. These voyages of discovery, which would ultimately lead to European colonization of the Americas and European domination of global trade, were motivated in part by the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. History is interconnected in ways that are often surprising. The fall of one city in 1453 helped to set in motion events that would reshape the entire world. Let's return to Mehmed for a moment, because his personality and vision shaped not just the siege, but what came after. Mehmed was known as Mehmed the Conqueror after 1453, but he was also called Mehmed II, indicating he was the second Ottoman Sultan with that name. He had actually been Sultan once before, briefly, when his father Murad II abdicated in 1444. But the young Mehmed, only 12 years old at the time, had proven unable to control the Janissaries and the court, and Murad had been forced to return to the throne. When Murad died in 1451, Mehmed became Sultan again at age 19, and this time he was determined to prove himself. Conquering Constantinople was how he would do it. The obsession with taking the city was personal. He saw himself as continuing the Islamic tradition of attempting to conquer the Christian capital. The Prophet Muhammad himself had supposedly said that Constantinople would one day be conquered, and blessed would be the army and the commander who achieved it. Mehmed wanted to be that commander. He wanted to be the one who succeeded where so many had failed. And he wanted to prove that he was the greatest Ottoman ruler, surpassing even his own father. After the conquest, Mehmed styled himself Caesar of Rome and claimed to be the legitimate successor to the Roman emperors. This was not just propaganda. He genuinely saw himself as inheriting the Roman tradition. He had the Hagia Sophia converted to a mosque, but he also preserved it rather than destroying it, recognizing its historical and architectural significance. He brought scholars to his court, both Muslim and Christian, and engaged in philosophical and theological debates. He was fluent in Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and possibly Serbian and Hebrew. He was interested in art and had his portrait painted by Italian artists, including Bellini. He collected books and manuscripts voraciously. This was not some crude barbarian warlord. This was a Renaissance prince who happened to be Muslim and happened to command one of the most powerful armies in the world. The idea that the fall of Constantinople was civilization destroyed by barbarism is wrong. It was one civilization replacing another, with all the complexity that entails. Mehmed didn't stop with Constantinople. Over the next 30 years, he continued expanding the Ottoman Empire. He conquered Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and parts of Greece. He warred with Venice. He even launched a brief and unsuccessful campaign into Italy, capturing Otranto in 1480, though the Ottomans withdrew after Mehmed's death in 1481. His vision was of an empire that would control the entire Mediterranean, and he came close to achieving it. The Ottomans under Mehmed and his successors would become one of the great powers of the early modern world, threatening Vienna twice in the 16th and 17th centuries, controlling the Middle East until the 20th century. And it all started with those 53 days outside Constantinople. Now let's talk about the legend and memory of the fall, because this event has cast a long shadow over both Greek and Turkish culture. For Greeks, particularly Greek Orthodox Christians, the fall of Constantinople is a wound that has never fully healed. It represents the loss of the Byzantine Empire, the end of Greek political independence until the 19th century, the subjugation of the Greek people to Ottoman rule for 400 years. The date, May 29th, is still remembered. In Greece, it's called Black Tuesday, and there are church services held in mourning. The dream of reclaiming Constantinople, of seeing the Hagia Sophia restored as a church, persisted for centuries, and arguably persists in some quarters even today. The Greek War of Independence in the 1820s was fought partly with the rhetoric of reclaiming the Byzantine legacy. The Megali idea, the great idea that dominated Greek politics in the 19th and early 20th centuries, was about recreating a Greek state that would include Constantinople. This led to the disastrous Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922, which ended with Greek defeat and the final end of any realistic hope of reclaiming Constantinople. But the emotional and cultural significance remains. For Turks, the conquest of Constantinople is a source of immense pride. Mehmed the Conqueror is a national hero. The Ottoman Empire at its height is remembered as a golden age when Turkish power dominated 3 continents. The conquest is seen as validation of Ottoman strength and Islamic faith. When the Hagia Sophia was converted back into a mosque in 2020, after having been a museum since 1935, it was celebrated by many Turks as a restoration of the building to its proper purpose, while Greeks and many others saw it as a provocative denial of the building's Christian heritage. The competing narratives show how the events of 1453 still resonate today. History is never just about the past. It's about how the past shapes identity and politics in the present. There's also the military history aspect that continues to fascinate. The fall of Constantinople is studied in military academies as a case study in siege warfare, in the use of emerging technology, in logistics and coordination. Mehmed's ability to move that massive army, to sustain it in the field for weeks, to coordinate land and naval forces, to employ artillery effectively, all of this was remarkable for 1453. The Ottomans were innovators. They took the developing technology of gunpowder weapons and pushed it further than most European states had at that point. They were early adopters of firearms for infantry, creating the Janissary Corps armed with arquebuses. They used artillery not just for sieges, but in field battles. They understood that warfare was changing and adapted accordingly. European armies would eventually catch up and surpass Ottoman military technology. But in the mid-15th century, the Ottomans were at the cutting edge. The siege also demonstrates the importance of morale and leadership in warfare. Constantine's leadership kept the defense going far longer than it should have based purely on numbers. His willingness to fight alongside his men, his refusal to abandon the city even when defeat was inevitable, inspired his soldiers to keep fighting when any rational assessment would have said they should surrender. On the Ottoman side, Mehmed's ability to keep his army motivated through weeks of heavy casualties, to maintain discipline when frustration must have been mounting, to push forward when multiple assaults had failed, this was leadership of a high order. Wars are not won just by having more men or better weapons. They're won by the side that refuses to give up, that maintains cohesion and determination when things get difficult. Both commanders demonstrated this quality, but ultimately Mehmed had more resources to draw on, and time was on his side. Let's consider some of the what-ifs of the siege, because there were several points where things could have gone differently. What if Constantine had received more substantial Western aid? If the Pope had managed to organize a crusade, if Venice and Genoa had sent fleets instead of token forces, if Hungary had marched south to threaten Ottoman territory and force Mehmed to divide his forces, Constantinople might have held. But none of that happened. The West was too divided, too distracted, too distrustful of the Byzantines. What if Giustiniani had not been wounded, or had stayed on the walls despite his wound? The defense might have held together for a few more hours or days. But could it have held indefinitely? Probably not. The walls were crumbling. The defenders were exhausted. Food and ammunition were running low. At best, holding out longer might have given time for a relief force to arrive, but no relief force was coming. What if the Byzantines had developed their own artillery capability that could match the Ottomans? This is an interesting counterfactual because it highlights the resource disparity. The Byzantines simply didn't have the money to fund major artillery production. Their empire had been reduced to a city and some scattered territories. Tax revenue was minimal. They were essentially bankrupt. Even if they had wanted to build cannons like Urbans, they couldn't have afforded it. This points to a larger truth about the fall of Constantinople. It wasn't lost in 1453. It was lost decades or even centuries earlier, when the empire began its long decline. The siege was just the final act in a tragedy that had been unfolding for a long time. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 was arguably the mortal wound. Everything after that was slow bleeding. What if Mehmed had failed at Constantinople? This is perhaps the most interesting counterfactual. If the siege had been repulsed, Mehmed's position as Sultan would have been severely weakened. The Ottoman Empire might have fallen into civil war as rival claimants challenged him. At minimum, Ottoman expansion into Europe would have been delayed or derailed. Constantinople might have survived another generation or even another century, though it's hard to see how it could have reversed its decline without somehow recovering its lost territories and tax base. But Western Europe would have had more time to organize a response to Ottoman expansion. The balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean would have looked very different. The exploration and colonization patterns might have changed if Ottoman control of trade routes had been delayed. One siege changed all of that. Mehmed won, and the course of history turned. The fall of Constantinople also needs to be understood in the context of the late medieval period and the transition to the early modern world. The 15th century was a time of enormous change in Europe and the wider world. The 100 Years' War between England and France ended in 1453, the same year Constantinople fell. The Wars of the Roses began in England soon after. The printing press was invented by Gutenberg around 1440, revolutionizing the spread of information. Exploration was beginning with Portuguese voyages down the African coast. The Renaissance was flowering in Italy. The Protestant Reformation was still decades away, but the conditions for it were developing. Feudalism was giving way to centralized monarchies. Medieval warfare was being transformed by gunpowder. It was a hinge point in history, and the fall of Constantinople was one of the events that marked the transition. The medieval world of knights and castles and static fortifications was ending. The early modern world of gunpowder and global trade and religious upheaval was beginning. One aspect that deserves more attention is the experience of ordinary people in Constantinople during the siege and the sack. We have lots of chronicles and accounts from leaders and nobility, but fewer from common people. But we can imagine what it was like. You're a shopkeeper or a labourer or a craftsman. You've lived in Constantinople your whole life. So did your parents and grandparents. This is your home. You know every street and square. You've worshipped in the same church since you were a child. Your neighbours are people you've known for years. And now suddenly your world is ending. You're conscripted to help defend the walls, hauling stones and timber, digging ditches, whatever is needed. You watch the cannons tear holes in walls that you thought were eternal. You smell the smoke and blood and decay. You hear the screams of the wounded and dying. You pray constantly, desperately, for deliverance that doesn't come. And then the city falls. The Janissaries burst through the gates and spread through the streets. You try to hide, try to protect your family, but there's nowhere to hide. If you're lucky, you're enslaved and survive. If you're unlucky, you're killed. If you're a woman or child, you face horrors that the chronicles barely hint at. Your home is looted. Everything you owned is taken or destroyed. The world you knew is simply gone. And afterward, if you survive, you have to figure out how to live in this new reality, where your city is ruled by conquerors who speak a different language, worship a different god, have different laws and customs. Some people adapted, some never did. Some fled if they could. Some stayed and endured. This was the experience of thousands of ordinary Byzantines. and it's worth remembering them alongside the emperors and sultans. The siege of Constantinople was recorded by multiple chroniclers on both sides, which gives us a relatively good idea of what happened, though the sources sometimes contradict each other on details. The Ottoman accounts naturally portray Mehmed as a brilliant commander, and the conquest as a triumph of Islamic faith and Ottoman power. The Byzantine and Italian accounts portray Constantine as a tragic hero and the fall as a catastrophe for Christendom. Both perspectives are coloured by their contexts, but taken together they give us a fuller picture. What's striking is how much agreement there is on the basic facts. The cannons, the assaults, the breaching of the walls, Constantine's death, the sack of the city, all of this is confirmed by multiple independent sources. The legend of Constantine becoming the Marble King and waiting to return is later mythology, but the core events of the siege are well documented. This makes Constantinople more knowable than many medieval events where sources are sparse or unreliable. In conclusion, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 was one of the pivotal events of world history. It ended the Byzantine Empire, and with it, the final remnant of the Roman Empire that had dominated the ancient and medieval worlds for 1500 years. It announced the arrival of the Ottoman Empire as a major power that would shape European, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean history for centuries. It demonstrated that gunpowder artillery had fundamentally changed warfare and that medieval fortifications were obsolete. It scattered Greek scholars and classical texts across Western Europe, contributing to the Renaissance. It disrupted trade routes and helped motivate the Age of Exploration. It left wounds in Greek culture and memory that persist to this day. And it gave us one of the great stories of human courage and determination. The story of 7,000 men standing on ancient walls against 80,000, knowing they would lose and fighting anyway. Constantine XI died as he had ruled, with dignity and courage, choosing death over dishonor. Mehmed II achieved his dream and became one of the great conquerors of history. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years fell. The city that had been the jewel of Christendom became the capital of an Islamic empire. And the world moved forward into a new age, leaving behind the medieval past and embracing the gunpowder future. That's the story of the fall of Constantinople, a story of endings and beginnings, of courage and cruelty, of old empires dying and new empires rising. It happened 571 years ago, but it still matters. It still resonates, because it reminds us that nothing lasts forever, that even the mightiest walls can fall, that empires rise and empires crumble, but the human capacity for courage and determination and sacrifice endures. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most dramatic sieges, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more history to explore, so many more stories of empires and battles and the people who shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.